Picture a room. Not a large room. Not a throne room or a Senate chamber or the floor of a stock exchange. A library. Dark wood paneling. Deep leather chairs. Shelves of books that have actually been read. A fire burning with the quiet authority of a fire that has never been allowed to go out. On one side of a table sits a man whose entire bearing communicates a species of power so absolute and so long established that it no longer needs to announce itself. He does not raise his voice. He does not pound the table. He does not threaten. He simply sits and looks at you with those eyes, those extraordinary, unsettling, deeply penetrating eyes, and waits for you to understand that the conversation has only one possible outcome, and that he already knows what it is, and that the only variable remaining is how long it will take you to arrive at the same conclusion. Across the table from him, on different occasions across different decades, sit the most powerful men in America. Senators, industrialists, railroad barons, the President of the United States. They come to this room in his house on Madison Avenue in New York City because there is nowhere else to go. Because he is the last resort and the first resort simultaneously. Because the American economy, the surging, crashing, rebuilding, recrashing, perpetually adolescent American economy of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, requires periodically the intervention of a single human will powerful enough to stop the panic, reorganize the wreckage, and set the machine running again. That human will belongs to John Pierpont Morgan. And the story of how one man came to occupy a position of financial power so absolute that he could, on at least 2 separate occasions, personally prevent the collapse of the United States economy. That story is one of the most extraordinary, most instructive, most disturbing, and most genuinely thrilling narratives in the entire history of American capitalism. It begins not in New York but in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837. The year itself is significant. 1837 was the year of one of the worst financial panics in American history, a collapse so severe that it threw hundreds of banks into insolvency and sent the young American economy into a prolonged depression. That a child born in such a year would grow up to become the defining figure of American finance is not, in retrospect, surprising. The crises of the 19th century American economy were not interruptions to the story of J.P. Morgan. They were the story. They were the conditions that made him not merely possible but necessary. His father was Junius Spencer Morgan, a banker of considerable achievement and even more considerable ambition, a man who had risen from the New England merchant class to the upper reaches of Anglo-American finance through a combination of native intelligence, impeccable integrity, and an almost preternatural ability to identify and cultivate the right relationships at the right moments. Junius would eventually move to London and partner with the Merchant Bank of George Peabody, one of the most influential financial institutions in the world, an operation that financed American railroads and government bonds and the kind of large-scale international capital flows that were, in the mid-19th century, remaking the physical and economic landscape of an entire continent. He was, in the language of that era, a man of standing, and standing in the world of Victorian-era banking was not a social distinction. It was a financial instrument. Your word, your name, your reputation for honor, these were, in an age before sophisticated financial regulation or transparent accounting, the only security that existed. Pierpont, as the family called him, distinguishing him from his father and grandfather, grew up in the shadow of this formidable figure and absorbed its lessons with the intense, slightly resentful thoroughness of a son who is determined to surpass his father while never quite being able to escape the mold the father has already cast. He was a difficult child, prone to illnesses that kept him bedridden for months at a time and that, paradoxically, may have accelerated his intellectual development, giving a restless, powerful mind extended periods of enforced stillness during which the only available activity was thinking. He had a condition called rosacea, a skin disorder that, as he aged, would cause his nose to enlarge and become deeply discolored, mottled red and purple in ways that were impossible to ignore. He was aware of this disfigurement his entire adult life. He refused to be photographed without considerable negotiation over the terms. He carried it not with shame but with a kind of defiant dignity, as if the ugliness of it was something he had decided, consciously, to overcome through the sheer force of everything else about him. He was educated partly in America, partly in Europe. His father sent him to the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he studied mathematics with the rigor of a young man who understood, at a molecular level, that numbers were power. Not numbers as abstraction, numbers as tool. The ability to see a balance sheet and understand immediately what it meant, to look at a bond issuance and calculate its true cost, to assess the creditworthiness of a railroad from its operating reports with the speed and accuracy that most men could not achieve after weeks of careful analysis. This was the foundational skill of the Morgan enterprise, and it was built in those German lecture halls with the systematic thoroughness of a builder laying a foundation he intends to last forever. He came to New York in 1857. Another year of financial panic as it happened, a detail that tells you something important about the rhythm of 19th-century American capitalism, and began his career as an accountant's apprentice at a firm called Duncan, Sherman and Company, which served as the American agent for his father's London operation. He was 20 years old. He was in the greatest city in the hemisphere, at the beginning of an era of explosive economic growth that would, within his own lifetime, transform the United States from a predominantly agricultural society into the most powerful industrial economy in the history of the world. And he was already, at 20 years old, different from every other person in the room. Not in his methods at first. The methods were standard: the careful analysis of credit, the assessment of character and collateral, the patient matching of capital with opportunity that was the essential function of a banking house. What was different was the quality of his attention. He looked at a business proposition with a completeness that left no ambiguity unexamined and no assumption unchallenged. He looked at the person proposing it with an even greater completeness, assessing character, motivation, reliability, judgment, the invisible qualities that balance sheets cannot capture but that determine, in the end, whether the numbers mean what they appear to mean. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a reader of human beings. And he was almost always right. The Civil War made him richer and made him, at the same time, the subject of his first serious controversy. A controversy that illustrates, with uncomfortable clarity, the degree to which the Morgan story contains not just triumph but shadow, not just genius but moral complexity. In 1861, a speculator named Arthur Eastman proposed a transaction to the 24-year-old Morgan. The federal government had a warehouse full of obsolete carbine rifles, weapons that had been condemned as defective, that in fact had a documented tendency to cut off the thumbs of the soldiers firing them. Eastman bought these rifles from the government for $3.50 each, then sold them back to a Union Army commander in the field, who apparently did not know or did not check their history, for $22 each. Morgan helped finance this transaction, advancing the capital that made the deal possible and taking his share of the profit. The rifles were delivered to soldiers in the field. The transaction was subsequently investigated and found to be fraudulent by a congressional commission. Morgan was called before the commission and testified. He was not prosecuted. But the episode sat in the record of his life like a splinter that could never quite be removed. Evidence that the young Morgan's financial appetite was not, in those early years, constrained by a moral framework that would have recognized the human cost of what he was financing. He moved on. He always moved on. He married Amelia Sturgis, Mimi, he called her, in 1861, and within 4 months she was dead of tuberculosis. A loss so devastating that it left a scar on his emotional landscape that never fully healed. He would marry again, Frances Louisa Tracy, whom he married in 1865 and who would give him 4 children and a stable domestic life. But the ghost of Mimi haunted him in ways that expressed themselves, over the decades, in a series of intimate friendships with women that defied easy categorization and that his biographers have never fully resolved. His capacity for feeling was, in all registers, enormous. This is perhaps the most surprising fact about J.P. Morgan for anyone who encounters him only through the legend of the cold financial titan. He wept at funerals. He formed intense, devoted, sometimes overwhelming attachments to people he admired. He collected art, not as investment, not as status symbol, but with the passionate, consuming, almost physical love of a man for whom beauty was as real a need as food. He collected books. He collected manuscripts. He built a library on East 36th Street that is, to this day, one of the most beautiful small buildings in New York City. A palazzo of pink Tennessee marble, designed by Charles McKim of McKim, Mead & White, filled with treasures accumulated over a lifetime of looking at the world and wanting to possess its finest expressions. He was, in short, fully human, capable of the full range of human virtue and human failure, human love and human indifference, human greatness and human compromise. He was not a simple figure. He was not a villain, despite what his critics would eventually say. He was not a hero, despite what his admirers believed. He was something rarer and more interesting than either. A genuinely consequential human being who operated at a scale and with a force that shaped the lives of millions of people who never knew his name and would not have recognized his face. But we need to understand the machinery he operated in the wild, chaotic, violent world of 19th-century American capitalism, before we can understand how he came to dominate it so completely.
Imagine a railroad.
Not the neat, regulated, safety-inspected railroad of the modern era. A 19th-century American railroad, a project of staggering physical ambition and financial recklessness, a thing built by Irish and Chinese immigrants swinging sledgehammers and blasting through mountains and bridging rivers in conditions that would horrify a modern safety inspector, financed by bond issues floated in London and New York, managed by men who were building an empire and skimming off the top in quantities that would today be called felony fraud and were then called, with a certain frontier admiration, good business. The railroads were the internet of the 19th century. They were the technology that transformed everything, that made the vast continental distances of America economically irrelevant, that opened the interior of the continent to settlement and agriculture and mining and manufacturing, that created national markets where regional ones had existed, that generated fortunes of a size that had no precedent in American history. They were also, from a financial standpoint, an almost complete disaster. Railroad companies issued too much stock. They issued too many bonds. They competed with each other in ways that made no economic sense, building parallel lines to the same destinations, cutting rates below cost in price wars that impoverished everyone, borrowing more money to fund losses that the rate wars generated, going bankrupt, being reorganized, issuing more stock on top of the old stock, and starting the cycle again. The financial history of American railroads in the second half of the 19th century reads like a case study in the inability of competitive capitalism, left completely to its own devices, to produce rational outcomes. It was chaos of a specifically financial variety, the kind of chaos that destroys the savings of ordinary investors, concentrates wealth in the hands of the operators most skilled at extracting value from the wreckage, and ultimately calls into being exactly the kind of organizing force that imposes order on the disorder. That organizing force in the railroad industry was J.P. Morgan. He entered the railroad business in the 1870s, initially as a mediator, a man who could bring competing railroad factions into a room and keep them there until they reached an agreement, because his reputation was such that both sides trusted his judgment more than they trusted each other. The first major test of this mediating role came in 1885, in what became known as the Corsair Compact. The Corsair was Morgan's steam yacht, a magnificent vessel, 204 feet long, that he used for business meetings when he wanted an environment that combined privacy with the particular psychological effect of being at sea, surrounded by water, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but talk. On a late summer day in 1885, he invited the presidents of two competing railroads, William Vanderbilt of the New York Central and George Roberts of the Pennsylvania Railroad, aboard the Corsair, and the three men spent the afternoon cruising up and down the Hudson River while Morgan guided them, with the patient authority of a man who had already decided what the agreement would look like and was simply waiting for the parties to discover that they agreed with him toward a settlement of the ruinous rate war that was destroying both companies. They reached a settlement. They signed it. They went home. And the news that Morgan had resolved the conflict spread through the financial world with the speed of a telegram and the weight of an announcement from on high. Because what the Corsair Compact demonstrated was not merely that Morgan was a skilled mediator. It demonstrated that he had the moral authority, the reputational weight, the personal force, to make the largest, most powerful corporations in America sit down at his table and do what he suggested. This was not legal power. It was not governmental power. It was something older and stranger and, in some ways, more absolute than either. It was the power of trust. In an economy without adequate regulation, without transparent accounting standards, without deposit insurance or bankruptcy courts that functioned reliably or any of the other institutional safeguards that modern capitalism takes for granted, the single most valuable commodity in American business was a reputation for integrity. A banker whose word meant something, whose assurance that a bond was sound was actually a guarantee, whose involvement in a transaction was itself evidence that the transaction was honest, was worth more to the economy than any specific deal he could structure or any specific capital he could deploy. He was a quality control mechanism for a system that had no other. Morgan understood this. Not cynically, not as a calculated strategy for building market share, though it was that too. He understood it because he had absorbed it from his father, who had absorbed it from George Peabody, in a tradition of Anglo-American merchant banking that went back generations and that was built on the absolute primacy of the kept promise. You said what you meant. You did what you said. You never, under any circumstances, let a client take a loss on a security you had vouched for without first exhausting every available remedy. Because if you did, word would spread, and the one thing you could not recover from in this business was the loss of trust. This principle, this absolute, non-negotiable commitment to the integrity of his word, was the foundation of the Morgan Empire. It was also, paradoxically, the source of his power over the men who sat across his table. They were not afraid of him, exactly. They were afraid of losing his support. Because Morgan's support meant access to capital, British capital, primarily, the enormous pools of European investment that were the lifeblood of American industrial development and that flowed, to a remarkable degree, through Morgan's firm. And without that capital, nothing got built. The railroad reorganizations, Morganizations, they were called, the term coined with a mixture of admiration and resentment that captured perfectly the ambivalence with which the country regarded its most powerful banker, became the defining activity of the 1880s and 1890s. One by one, the great railroad systems of America passed through Morgan's hands. The Philadelphia and Reading, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Erie, the Northern Pacific, the Southern Railway. He took each in turn, restructured its finances, replaced its management, forced its competing creditors to accept terms that made the business viable, and then reorganized its capital structure in ways that left Berkshire sorry, that left Morgan's firm in a position of lasting influence over the reorganized entity, usually through representation on the board of directors. The pattern was always the same, and it was always effective, and it was always enormously profitable. Take a bankrupt or near-bankrupt railroad. Assess its actual value. Convince the bondholders to accept less than face value in exchange for new securities that reflected the real situation. Raise new capital from European investors who trusted the Morgan name. Reduce the debt load to a level the business could service. Install professional management or discipline the existing management, and impose operating standards that would make the railroad actually function as a business rather than as a financial instrument for its owners to loot. Emerge from the process with a railroad that was solvent, functional, and carrying on its board of directors at least one Morgan partner or Morgan ally, whose job was to ensure that the insane competitive behavior that had caused the previous crisis did not immediately cause the next one. Consider what Morganization actually looked like from the inside. A railroad company had just filed for bankruptcy, or was on the verge of it, which amounted to the same thing. Its bonds were trading at 30 cents on the dollar. Its shareholders had been wiped out. Its creditors, a fractious army of British insurance companies, American trust funds, German banks, Swiss private investors, were all pulling in different directions, each trying to maximize their own recovery at the expense of every other creditor. A process that would, if allowed to continue, result in the destruction of the railroad itself and the recovery of perhaps nothing at all. Into this chaos walked a Morgan partner. Not Morgan himself at first, the partners were the instruments, the advance team. They would assess the situation with brutal analytical precision. What were the railroad's assets actually worth? What was its earning power, stripped of the debt service that was crushing it? What would a rational capital structure look like? How much debt could the business genuinely support, and at what interest rate and in what seniority? The partners produced memoranda that were, in the culture of Morgan's firm, expected to be not merely correct but impervious to challenge. Every number defended, every assumption examined, every scenario stress-tested against the possibility of error. Then Morgan himself would convene the creditors. This meeting, the creditors' meeting, the moment when the competing parties were brought into the same room and asked to accept terms that none of them found entirely satisfactory, was where the Morgan magic, if you want to call it that, was most visible. He would present the plan. He would explain, with the patient authority of a teacher addressing students who he expected to understand him the first time, that the plan was the best outcome available, that the alternatives were worse, and that the time for debate was over. He did not shout. He did not threaten, not explicitly. He simply communicated, through the quality of his attention and the weight of his reputation and the invisible force of his absolute certainty, that opposition was pointless, that the room would eventually arrive at the conclusion he had already reached, and that the only variable was how long it would take. He was almost always right. Not because he was a bully, the bankers and investors who worked with him consistently described him as fair, as genuinely concerned with finding solutions that gave every party a reasonable outcome. But because his judgment about what was achievable was simply better than anyone else's in the room, and over time, enough people had seen enough evidence of this that the trust he commanded was genuine, not merely coerced. Within a decade, J.P. Morgan and his partners and allies controlled, directly or indirectly, approximately 1/3 of all the railroad mileage in the United States. 1/3 of the physical infrastructure of the American economy. One man, one firm, one network of relationships, built over decades of trust and competence and the very specific kind of authority that comes from being the person who showed up when the system collapsed and fixed it every single time. But the railroads were only the beginning. The 1890s brought a new crisis, this one not merely industrial but existential, in a way that the railroad wars had never quite been. In 1893, a financial panic of extraordinary severity swept through the American economy. Banks failed in waves. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment surged. And then, in 1895, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the United States, and that would have been considered 10 years earlier as literally impossible. The United States Treasury ran out of gold. The American dollar was, at this time, backed by gold, the gold standard, which required the Treasury to maintain sufficient gold reserves to redeem paper currency on demand. If confidence in the dollar fell and people began demanding gold in exchange for their paper, the Treasury had to be able to deliver. If it couldn't, the dollar would collapse, credit would freeze, and the already stricken economy would plunge into a depression that would make 1893 look like a mild correction. In early 1895, the gold reserve had fallen to a level so low that the Treasury literally did not have enough gold to get through the next week. President Grover Cleveland was informed that he had, by some estimates, a matter of days before the government could no longer honor its obligations. The Congress would not act. A bill to sell bonds to replenish the gold reserve had just failed. The Secretary of the Treasury was in a state of barely controlled panic. And the President of the United States, who believed more deeply than almost any modern person can easily imagine in the sanctity of the separation between private finance and government, found himself with no alternative. He sent for J.P. Morgan. Morgan had known the crisis was coming. He had been watching the gold drain for months, had warned Treasury officials, had sent messages to Washington through intermediaries, had done everything that a private citizen could properly do to alert the government to a disaster that he could see forming on the horizon. When those warnings went unheeded, he waited. Not with impatience, with the specific, calculating patience of a man who understood that the worse the situation became, the more indispensable he would be when it finally reached the point of no return. He took the night train from New York to Washington. He arrived at the Willard Hotel and sent word to the White House. The president's secretary informed him that Cleveland did not wish to meet, that the administration was considering other options, that Morgan should go home and wait. Morgan sent back a message that has gone down in the folklore of American finance as one of the most extraordinary pieces of private diplomacy ever delivered. He said, in essence, that he understood the president did not wish to see him, but that there existed, in his knowledge, an obscure but valid legal authority by which the Treasury could purchase gold directly from private parties without congressional approval, and that he proposed to use this mechanism to deliver $65 million in gold to the Treasury in exchange for government bonds, and that, if the president chose not to meet with him, the crisis would continue and he would still be at the Willard Hotel when the president changed his mind. Cleveland changed his mind. Morgan was admitted to the White House. The deal was negotiated $65 million in gold, assembled by Morgan from his own resources and from European banking contacts, delivered to the Treasury in exchange for bonds issued under the archaic legal mechanism Morgan had identified. The gold reserve was replenished. The dollar held. The panic subsided. The United States government had been rescued from fiscal catastrophe by a private banker who had essentially refused to leave town until the president agreed to let him help. The reaction to this episode split the country with a ferocity that has never entirely healed. Morgan's defenders, and there were many among the business community especially, pointed out that he had saved the country from a disaster that the government had been incapable of preventing, and that the terms of the deal, while profitable for Morgan, were not unreasonable given the risk he had taken. His critics, and they were louder and they were right about certain things, pointed out that a democracy had been placed in a position where a private banker had more effective economic power than the elected government, and that this was not a temporary emergency to be quickly resolved but a symptom of a structural problem that would continue to produce crises until addressed. The structural problem was simple to describe and fiendishly difficult to solve. The United States, unlike every other major industrial nation, had no central bank, no lender of last resort, no institution with the authority and the resources to provide liquidity to the banking system during a panic, to act as the counterweight to the violent cycles of expansion and contraction that characterized 19th-century American finance. Every other serious economy in the world, Britain, France, Germany, had a central bank. America, out of a deep-seated historical suspicion of concentrated financial power rooted in the Jacksonian tradition, had refused to create one. And in the absence of a central bank, a private banker named Morgan had become, by default, the de facto central bank of the United States. He filled this role not because he sought it, or at least not only because he sought it. He filled it because the alternative was catastrophe, and because he was the only person in America with the resources, the relationships, and the credibility to make it work. And he filled it with the specific kind of authority that only someone in his position could exercise, an authority that was simultaneously less than what a government institution would have had. He could not compel anyone to do anything. Every transaction was voluntary, and more, he could make the voluntary transaction feel, in practice, irresistible, because the alternative to dealing with him was to deal with the consequences of not dealing with him. The Morgan of the 1890s was a figure of almost mythological stature in American public life. He was 50 years old. He was physically massive, broad shoulders, powerful build, the bearing of a man who had never once in his life felt uncertain about his right to occupy the space he occupied. The eyes, dark, intense, penetrating, were the feature that everyone who met him mentioned first and remembered longest. Theodore Roosevelt, who was not easily intimidated by anyone, described meeting Morgan's gaze as an experience he could not entirely account for. A journalist of the era wrote that to look into Morgan's eyes was to feel that he could see through you to the wall behind you. Henry Adams, the historian and grandson of presidents, who was not given to hyperbole, said simply that Morgan was the most powerful personal force he had ever encountered. He lived on a scale commensurate with his power. Corsair, eventually replaced by Corsair II and then the magnificent Corsair III, a 300-foot ocean-going steam yacht that was the largest private vessel in American waters, carried him up and down the Atlantic coast, to Europe, to wherever the business of the Morgan Empire required his physical presence. His house at 219 Madison Avenue was a monument of restrained Victorian grandeur. His country estate at Cragston, on the Hudson River, was where he retreated when the pace of New York became too much even for him. And his library, the Marble Palazzo on East 36th Street, completed in 1906, was where he kept the things he loved most. The manuscripts, the illuminated books, the old master drawings, the jewels and bronzes and tapestries accumulated over a lifetime of acquisitive passion that was, in its way, as forceful and as indiscriminate as his business acquisitiveness. He spent, at the peak of his collecting, sums on art and books that would today be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. When his son pointed out, at one juncture, that the art collecting was becoming expensive, Morgan replied with a line that has been quoted ever since as the perfect encapsulation of a certain kind of wealth psychology. If you have to ask the price, you can't afford it. But the story was about to enter its most dramatic chapter. Because in 1901, J.P. Morgan did something that made everything he had done before, the railroad reorganizations, the gold rescue, the endless financial mediations, look, in comparison, modest. He bought the United States Steel Corporation into existence. To understand what this meant, you need to understand the steel industry in 1900. Steel was not merely a commodity. It was the physical substance of the modern world. The railroads were made of it. The bridges were made of it. The skyscrapers that were beginning to transform the skylines of American cities were made of it. The ships and the locomotives and the machinery of American manufacturing, all of it ultimately depended on the production of steel. And the production of American steel at the turn of the century was controlled by a man named Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was, by 1900, the richest man on earth. He had built his empire from nothing, from a Scottish immigrant boyhood of genuine poverty, through decades of ferocious, brilliant, ruthless industrial development, and it was an empire of extraordinary physical and financial scale. His mills in Pittsburgh and the surrounding region produced roughly a quarter of all the steel made in the United States. His costs were lower than any competitor. His technology was more advanced. His control over the supply chain, iron or coke, railroads, ships, was so complete that it amounted, in practice, to a monopoly on efficient steel production. And Carnegie was threatening to go further. He was planning, in 1900, to build his own railroad network, to construct the infrastructure that would allow him to transport his steel directly to market without depending on the railroad networks that Morgan controlled. He was also rumored to be planning an expansion into finished steel products, wire, tubes, beams, that would bring him into direct competition with the companies that Morgan's clients owned and financed. This was unacceptable to Morgan, not merely because it threatened specific business interests, though it did. It was unacceptable because it threatened the order that Morgan had spent 3 decades constructing. The competitive carnage he had seen in the railroads, the same ruinous price wars and overinvestment and financial destruction, would be replicated in steel if Carnegie carried out his plans. And the scale of the destruction, given the size of the steel industry's capital base, would be even more catastrophic. The solution Morgan arrived at was audacious in its scale and its simplicity. He would buy Carnegie out. He would pay Carnegie whatever he wanted, whatever price would make the most successful industrialist in the history of American manufacturing decide that the money was better than the fight. He would then combine Carnegie's operations with every other major steel company in the country into a single entity so large that competition within the industry would become, for practical purposes, impossible. The negotiations were conducted through an intermediary, Charles Schwab, Carnegie's chief executive, who gave a famous dinner speech in December 1900 that Morgan attended and that laid out, with the rhetorical skill of a born salesman, the vision of a unified steel industry organized for maximum efficiency rather than maximum competition. Morgan listened. He approached Schwab after the dinner. He said, in the forward formulation that has echoed through the financial history of the United States ever since, "If Carnegie will sell, I'll buy." Carnegie named his price in pencil on a slip of paper. $480 million. In 1901, $480 million, at a time when the entire federal budget of the United States was roughly $500 million. Carnegie was asking, in effect, for the equivalent of the annual expenditure of the American government in exchange for his steel mills. Morgan looked at the number. He said without hesitation, "I accept." He never haggled with Carnegie. He said later that the price was fair and that haggling would have been an insult to a man of Carnegie's stature. This was true. It was also the case that Morgan understood something that Carnegie, in his retirement, would spend years reflecting on. The value Morgan was creating by combining the industry was so much larger than the price he was paying that the number, whatever it was almost irrelevant. The United States Steel Corporation was capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world. It controlled 60% of American steel production. It employed 168,000 people. It owned or deposits, coal fields, railroads, and manufacturing facilities spread across the American industrial heartland. And it was, from its inception, a J.P. Morgan creation, structured, financed, and governed according to Morgan principles, with Morgan partners and Morgan allies in key positions throughout the organization. When the news broke, the reaction was extraordinary. The financial press was staggered by the scale of the thing. Ordinary Americans were divided between awe and terror. The cartoon images of Morgan that began appearing in the press around this time, the massive figure, the ferocious eyes, the octopus arms reaching around the globe, captured something real about the popular perception of what had just happened. A private citizen had assembled a corporation larger than most national governments. In a country that had fought a revolution against concentrated power, that had written separation of powers into its founding documents, that had spent its entire history suspicious of privilege and aristocracy, the emergence of a man who could, apparently, do whatever he wished with the largest economy in the world produced a reaction that was equal parts admiration and existential alarm. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in September 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley, felt this alarm with a special intensity. Roosevelt was not an economic radical. He was not opposed to capitalism or wealth or large corporations as such. But he was, with every fiber of his extraordinarily energetic being, a nationalist. A man who believed that the power of the American state must be sufficient to maintain control over the forces that operated within it, that a democracy could not survive if private economic power was allowed to grow so large that it overwhelmed the capacity of elected government to regulate it. He decided to test this proposition against the biggest target available. He directed his attorney general to file an antitrust suit against the Northern Securities Company, a Morgan creation, a holding company that controlled the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Railroads and that, in Roosevelt's view, represented an illegal monopoly on rail transportation in the northern tier of the country. Morgan was genuinely shocked, not because he was unfamiliar with the antitrust laws, he knew them well, but because, in his understanding of how things worked, this was not how things were done. When there was a problem between a major banking house and the government, you sat down and negotiated. You sent word through intermediaries. You arranged a meeting. You found a solution that served everyone's interests. The idea of a lawsuit, a public adversarial winner-take-all legal confrontation, was, to Morgan's mind, a category error. It was the kind of thing that happened when governments dealt with ordinary businesses run by ordinary men, not when they dealt with someone of his position and his history and his services to the nation. He went to Washington. He walked into the White House. He looked at Roosevelt across a desk and said, in the direct language of a man accustomed to resolving disputes through negotiation rather than litigation, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt later described this encounter with a mixture of admiration for Morgan's audacity and absolute certainty that the answer had to be no. He told his attorney general that Morgan's approach revealed, with perfect clarity, exactly the problem he was trying to address. Morgan saw the government as a rival power to be negotiated with, not as the sovereign authority of the American people. The government was not Morgan's equal, to be dealt with through private intermediaries. The government represented the public, and the public had the right, through its elected representatives and its laws, to determine the conditions under which private economic power could be exercised. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government in 1904. Northern Securities was dissolved. It was the first significant antitrust victory of the Roosevelt era, and it signaled with unmistakable clarity that the age of unchecked private financial power was beginning to meet its limits. Morgan was furious. He never entirely forgave Roosevelt. He told friends that the government's behavior was dishonorable, that he had served the country too well, for too long, to be treated as a criminal. His anger was genuine, and it was also, in its way, revealing. He had genuinely not understood, or had genuinely refused to accept, that the scale of the power he had accumulated was itself a political fact that required a political response. He had been operating, for 30 years, as if the economy was a technical problem to be solved by experts, and he was the greatest available expert. The idea that the economy was also, primarily, ultimately, a political reality subject to democratic judgment and democratic control, was not one he had ever fully internalized. But the Northern Securities case did not break Morgan. It inconvenienced him. It set a precedent. It changed, at the margins, the way he operated. But the fundamental reality of his power, the reality that flowed from his control of capital, his relationships with European investors, his position at the center of the American banking network, that reality could not be dissolved by a court order. He was still the man you called when the system crashed. And the system was about to crash in a way that made everything before it look like a rehearsal. October 1907. The Panic of 1907. In a sequence of events that began with the collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, a major New York bank brought down by a speculative corner in copper stocks that went catastrophically wrong, the American banking system began to come apart. Bank runs spread from institution to institution with the terrifying speed of financial contagion. Depositors lined up at dawn and stood in queues that stretched around city blocks, waiting to withdraw their savings before the doors closed for good. Stock prices collapsed. Credit froze. The New York Stock Exchange was within hours of a complete shutdown. Not a temporary closure but a permanent cessation of trading, which would have been, in 1907, a financial catastrophe of almost inconceivable dimensions. Morgan was 70 years old. He was in a church in Richmond, Virginia, attending an Episcopal convention, when the news reached him. He took the first available train to New York. He arrived at his Madison Avenue library in the early evening of Saturday, October 19th, and for the next 3 weeks, that library became the emergency command center of the American financial system. What followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes of personal crisis management in the history of modern capitalism. Morgan convened the major New York bankers in his library, not the boardrooms of their institutions, not the offices of the Treasury Department, not any neutral government space. His library, his space, his terms. He sat at the head of the table and organized the response to the panic with the systematic authority of a military commander directing a battle. He assessed each threatened institution. He decided which were worth saving and which were not. He organized emergency loans from the healthy banks to the threatened ones, creating, through sheer personal authority, the liquidity backstop that only a central bank was supposed to be able to provide. There was a moment, the most dramatic single moment in the entire crisis, the moment that has been retold in virtually every account of J.P. Morgan's life, that occurred in the early hours of a November morning, after days of continuous negotiation. The trust companies of New York, the savings institutions that had been hardest hit by the panic, needed $25 million by the morning to stay open. The money did not exist. The time was past midnight. The men who had to provide it were exhausted, frightened, and deeply reluctant to commit further resources to what looked, to many of them, like a bottomless pit. Morgan locked the doors of the library. He told the assembled bankers that they were not leaving until the money was committed. He told them that if they did not act, the banking system would collapse in the morning, and that every one of them would lose far more than the amount he was asking them to commit tonight. He told them this with the absolute certainty of a man who had been thinking about financial crises for 50 years and knew exactly where this one was heading. Then he sat down at the card table in the corner and played solitaire. He waited. One by one, over the next several hours, the bankers came to him. One by one, they signed. By 4:30 in the morning, the $25 million was committed. The doors of the library were opened. The men went home. The trust companies opened in the morning. The panic, over the days that followed, subsided. He had done it again. 70 years old, operating through personal authority alone, he had prevented the collapse of the American banking system for the second time in his career. The newspapers said it plainly and without embarrassment. J.P. Morgan had saved the country. The Secretary of the Treasury, who had been a passenger in Morgan's crisis management from the beginning, contributing government funds, following Morgan's direction, acting essentially as a subordinate in the man's own library, told reporters that the country owed Morgan a debt it could not easily quantify. Roosevelt, still in the White House, sent a letter of thanks. The financial community erupted in near-unanimous gratitude. But the man who understood the implications of the 1907 panic most clearly was not Morgan. It was a young senator from Rhode Island named Nelson Aldrich, who would spend the next 5 years shepherding through Congress the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve System, the central bank that the United States had refused to establish for 100 years, that 3 generations of American politicians had rejected on ideological grounds, and that the panic of 1907 made undeniable. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. Its creation was, in a profound historical irony, the final act in the Morgan story. The institution that was designed, in part, to ensure that the American financial system would never again depend on the intervention of a single private citizen to survive a crisis. That institution was the direct consequence of J.P. Morgan's career. He had made himself so necessary that the country had been forced to create, in his image and by his example, a public institution capable of doing what he had always done privately. By the time the Federal Reserve was created, Morgan was almost gone. He had been called, in 1912, to testify before the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into what the newspapers called the Money Trust, the interlocking network of financial power that Morgan and his allies had built over 4 decades. The committee produced evidence that was, to modern eyes, remarkable in its detail. Morgan and his partners held, collectively, seats on the boards of directors of corporations with combined assets of more than $22 billion. The scope of this control, the railroads, the steel companies, the insurance companies, the banks, the utilities, the shipping lines, the telegraph companies, all of it connected through the Morgan network into a single, loosely coordinated financial web, was laid before the public in a way that had never been done before. Morgan testified. He was old now, 75, his health failing, the giant body beginning to lose the authority that had once made a room stop when he entered it. But the testimony was remarkable for one exchange above all others. A congressman asked him whether a man's credit was based upon his money or his property. Morgan's answer has been repeated, analyzed, disputed, and admired for more than 100 years. He said, "No. The first thing is character, before money or property. Because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. Character before money, trust before collateral." This was the Morgan Principle, stated in its most fundamental form, before a congressional committee that was investigating whether he had too much power, and the irony of the moment, the specific poignancy of a man defending the integrity of his lifelong operating principle in the very room where that principle was being indicted, was not lost on the observers who were present. Morgan sailed for Europe in late 1912. He had been doing this for decades, the annual voyage, the visits to the dealers and auction houses and church auctions where his agents had located the next treasure, the long, slow days on the water that gave his enormous, overdriven mind the only rest it ever truly found. He reached Rome. He stopped at the Grand Hotel. He became ill, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic event, but in the gradual, irreversible way of a very old and very tired man whose body had finally decided that it had done enough. He died on March 31, 1913. He was 75 years old. He had survived financial panics, antitrust suits, congressional investigations, 2 world wars of industrial competition, the transformation of the American economy from an agricultural to an industrial civilization, and the sustained, furious opposition of politicians, labor leaders, journalists, and reformers who believed, with varying degrees of accuracy, that he represented the most dangerous concentration of private power in American democratic history. When his will was opened, the financial world was in for one of the great surprises of the era. Morgan's fortune, which had been assumed to be in the hundreds of millions, turned out to be approximately $80 million. A very large sum by any normal standard, but nothing like the colossal accumulation that his power and his lifestyle had suggested. Andrew Carnegie, told of the actual figure, reportedly said, "And to think he was not a rich man." Carnegie, of course, was thinking in terms of his own $480 million sale. What he was pointing to, without quite realizing it, was the defining characteristic of the Morgan enterprise. Morgan had not been trying to accumulate money. He had been trying to build an order, a system, a financial architecture for the American economy that was rational, stable, and governed by principles of integrity and efficiency rather than by the chaotic appetites of speculators and promoters. He had spent his money, freely, constantly, on art, on travel, on his library, on the charitable institutions he quietly supported, on the expenses of running the most prestigious banking operation in the world, because money was not, for him, the point. Power was the point. Influence was the point. The ability to make the system work was the point. He succeeded, by his own terms, completely. And he failed, by the terms of the democracy he served, equally completely. Because the power he had accumulated was, by the standards of democratic governance, illegitimate, not because it was exercised corruptly, but because it was exercised privately, without accountability, without transparency, without the checks and balances that a self-governing society had a right to impose on forces that shaped the conditions of every citizen's economic life. This is the permanent tension at the heart of the Morgan story. He was necessary. He was genuine. He was, in the specific technical sense of the word, great in the sense that very few human beings in any era manage to be, the sense that involves operating at a scale and with a consequence that bends the arc of history. The America that emerged from the Morgan era, industrialized, urbanized, financially sophisticated, globally connected, was not simply the America that would have existed without him. He shaped it, in ways that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes destructive and always immense. But he also demonstrated, by the sheer enormity of his power, the limits of the proposition that private genius could substitute for public institution. The Federal Reserve exists because Morgan existed. The antitrust laws were enforced because Morgan's empire made clear what happened when they weren't. The regulatory framework of modern American finance was built, piece by piece, in the decades after his death, in direct response to the lessons his career had taught about what concentrated private financial power could and could not be trusted to do. He is gone now for more than a century. The firm that bears his name, J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, is a very different institution from the private partnership he ran from that office at 23 Wall Street. It is publicly held, heavily regulated, subject to the oversight of multiple government agencies. constrained by rules and capital requirements and stress tests that the original Morgan would have found incomprehensible in their intrusiveness. The world he built, the world where a single man's character and judgment could substitute, in a crisis, for the institutional machinery of a central bank, that world is gone intentionally and permanently. And yet, when the great financial crises of the modern era arrive, when Lehman Brothers falls, when the credit markets freeze, when the panic spreads and the phones light up in the offices of Treasury secretaries and Federal Reserve chairmen, the men who receive those calls still reach, instinctively, for the model that Morgan provided. Gather the key players. Establish who can be saved and who cannot. Organize the resources that exist. Commit them quickly at scale before confidence collapses entirely. These are Morgan's methods institutionalized. He was the last man who could do what he did. He was also, in the most important sense, the reason that no one man will ever need to do it again. Think of that library on East 36th Street. The fire still burning. The leather chairs still deep. The shelves of books still keeping their patient counsel. A man at a card table, playing solitaire, while the bankers argue around him, while the fate of the American economy hangs in the precise balance of a few hours and a few signatures. He does not look up from his cards. He has done this before. He knows how it ends. He is waiting for the others to arrive at the same knowledge. The doors of the library are locked from the inside. They will not open until the country has been saved. They never do. End of script. There is a dimension of the Morgan story that the financial histories tend to underweight, because it sits uncomfortably beside the narrative of ruthless power, and that is the degree to which Morgan genuinely believed he was providing a public service. Not as a rationalization, not as a cover story for self-interest, as a deeply held conviction that animated every major decision of his professional life. He had watched, from his earliest years in the banking business, the consequences of the alternative. He had seen what happened when the American financial system was left entirely to its own devices, when promoters issued worthless securities to trusting investors, when railroad presidents looted their companies through stock manipulation, when banks lent recklessly on assets they hadn't properly valued and then collapsed when the assets proved worth less than the loans, when panic spread through the credit markets like fire through dry grass, destroying the savings of working people who had done nothing wrong and whose only mistake was to have trusted a system that had no one minding it. He had seen all of this, and he had spent his career trying to impose on this system the same standards of integrity and prudence that his father had drilled into him as a young man. This was not altruism. He profited enormously from the order he created, and the firms that competed with Morgan on lower standards of conduct were, in the long run, firms that Morgan either absorbed or watched fail. His integrity was, in the most literal economic sense, a competitive advantage. But it was also real. The testimony about character before bonds in Christendom was not performance. It was the operating principle of a man who had built everything he owned on the foundation of his word. Consider the way he handled the General Electric consolidation. In 1892, Morgan organized the merger of Edison General Electric, the company Thomas Edison had founded to commercialize his electrical inventions, with the Thomson-Houston Electric Company, a competitor. The resulting company, General Electric, became one of the great corporations of the 20th century. But what is less often told is the context in which this merger occurred and the role Morgan played in making Edison whole, even as he was, in a sense, removing him from his own company. Edison had been, from a financial standpoint, a difficult client. He was a genius, an inventor of supernatural productivity and insight, a man whose laboratory at Menlo Park had produced more significant innovations in a single decade than most industries see in a century. But he was not a businessman. He did not understand capital allocation. He did not understand the difference between the money needed to run a laboratory and the money needed to build a nationwide electrical infrastructure. He had borrowed and borrowed and borrowed again, and the Edison companies were perpetually undercapitalized and perpetually dependent on new infusions of capital to avoid collapse. Morgan had been an early investor in Edison's electrical work, had, famously, been among the first private residents of New York to have his Madison Avenue house wired for electric lighting, an event that had gone memorably wrong when the installation caused a fire that required the prompt attention of both the fire department and the inventor himself. He had stuck with Edison through the capital crises, had arranged loans and bond issues and equity infusions, had been the financial backstop for the electrical revolution without ever quite receiving the credit that the inventors who made that revolution possible routinely received. When the merger came, Edison was not pleased. He had always resisted consolidation. He saw it as a dilution of his control, a compromise of his technical vision, a submission to the financial logic that he found both necessary and slightly contemptible. Morgan explained, with the patient authority of a man who had been explaining financial realities to reluctant clients for 30 years, that the alternative to consolidation was a competitive war that neither Edison General Electric nor Thomson Houston could win without destroying each other, and that the investors who had provided the capital would not continue to do so under those conditions. Edison accepted. He received stock in the new company worth several $1 million. He used the proceeds to fund his laboratory for the rest of his working life, inventing the phonograph and the motion picture camera and dozens of other devices that changed the world. The irony, the specific emblematic irony of the Morgan story, was that his financial reorganization of the electrical industry made possible the continuing inventiveness of the man who had been, in some sense, displaced by it. Morgan did not see this as a contradiction. He saw it as the natural operation of a system where finance and innovation had to coexist, where the people who provided capital had the right to organize it efficiently, and where the greatest inventors in the world were ultimately dependent on the greatest financial organizers in the world to translate their genius into the physical infrastructure that made it available to everyone. He was right about some of this. He was wrong about enough of it that the country spent the next century trying to correct the imbalances his confidence had created. The men who worked for him inhabited a world of extraordinary intensity and extraordinary reward. A partner at J.P. Morgan and Company in the 1890s was, by definition, one of the most powerful figures in American finance. The partnership structure, no public shareholders, no board of directors beyond the partners themselves, no obligation to disclose earnings or holdings or the details of any transaction, gave the firm an operational freedom that no modern publicly traded institution can imagine. Decisions were made quickly, by men who trusted each other's judgment and who knew that their personal fortunes were directly at stake in every position the firm took. There was no hiding behind the corporate veil. If the firm made a bad bet, the partners lost money from their own pockets. This concentrated the minds wonderfully. The culture Morgan created in that firm was, by every account, one of absolute standards and no tolerance for deviation from them. A Morgan partner who recommended a security that subsequently proved unsound, who had put the Morgan name on something that failed, faced consequences that were not merely professional but personal, social, moral in the fullest sense that word can carry. Morgan himself had once paid out of his own pocket to make whole the investors in a bond issue that had gone wrong, even though he had no legal obligation to do so, because he believed that the Morgan name on the prospectus constituted, in effect, a personal guarantee of quality. The amount was significant. He paid it without complaint. And the story circulated through the banking community for decades, reinforcing the reputation that was the firm's most valuable asset. This was the Morgan method in its purest expression. Make your standards so high, and the consequences of falling below them so severe, that the system self-policed. Not through regulation, not through government oversight, through the accumulated weight of reputation and the social sanctions of a tightly interconnected community of financial professionals who all knew each other and all knew each other's histories, and for whom the loss of Morgan's trust was the professional equivalent of excommunication. It worked, within its limitations, extraordinarily well. For the men who operated within the Morgan network, it produced decades of stability and prosperity. For the men outside it, the promoters and speculators and wildcat operators who inhabited the financial world beyond Morgan's reach, it produced nothing except the periodic crises that demonstrated again and again why the Morgan standards existed in the first place. The question the country was never quite able to resolve was whether the cure, a private financial empire of almost unlimited power, accountable to no one except its own internal standards of integrity, was preferable to the disease. Theodore Roosevelt's answer was no. Louis Brandeis, the lawyer and future Supreme Court justice who wrote a famous series of articles called Other People's Money, that systematically anatomized the structure of the Morgan financial empire, answered with an equally emphatic no. The Pujo Committee's answer, delivered in its report of 1913, was a nuanced but ultimately negative no. Morgan's own answer was that the question itself was malformed, that the dichotomy between private financial power and public accountability was false, that integrity and competence were their own form of accountability, that the proof of the system was in its results, and that the results spoke for themselves. He died before the argument was fully resolved. It has never been fully resolved. It continues in different forms and with different institutional actors in every serious debate about the regulation of financial markets and the relationship between private capital and democratic governance that the modern world produces. The ghost of J.P. Morgan sits at the table in every one of these debates, not as a participant, but as the defining example of what the debate is actually about. The reference case, the extreme to which the argument always returns. There was, in the years immediately preceding his death, a softening, not of his powers, which remained formidable until the end, but of the public image, the legendary ferocity. He gave interviews, occasionally, that revealed the human being beneath the monument. He talked about music, he genuinely loved it, had supported the Metropolitan Opera since its founding, had been instrumental in making New York a serious opera city in the years when it was still primarily a commercial one. He talked about his library with a warmth that was entirely different from the controlled authority of his business pronouncements. He admitted once that the thing he was most proud of was not a business deal or a financial rescue but the library. The building, the collection, the idea that a man who had spent his life moving money could also have spent it moving beauty into the world. He had financed, in addition to his own collections, the construction or renovation of churches, hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions in numbers that his biographers have never fully catalogued, because Morgan did not publicize his charitable giving. He considered it a private matter, the way he considered many of the most important things about himself private matters, shielded from the press and the public by the wall of controlled authority that was, for most of his life, his primary means of self-presentation to the world. On the train to Rome in 1912, he was observed by a fellow passenger who did not know who he was. The man wrote afterward, in a letter to a friend, that he had sat across from an elderly gentleman who had a presence about him unlike anything he had encountered. Not imposing exactly, in the way of a man still in command, but something gentler and more melancholy, the presence of a man carrying a very great weight with very great patience. The gentleman had been reading, mostly. Occasionally he had looked out the window at the Italian countryside passing in the autumn light. Once, the observer wrote, he had smiled to himself about something in the book, a brief, private smile, the smile of a man in the company of an old friend. The book was a volume of religious verse. Morgan had been, his entire adult life, a deeply committed Episcopalian, a churchman in the most serious Victorian sense, someone for whom religious faith was not a social performance but a genuine private anchor, a source of comfort and meaning that sat alongside and sometimes in tension with the ferocious commercial life that occupied his daylight hours. He attended services regularly. He served on church committees. He gave to church institutions with the same generosity he brought to every charitable cause he believed in. The faith was real, and it was personal, and it was nobody's business but his own. He died on March 31, 1913, in the Grand Hotel in Rome, with his son Jack at his bedside. The stock market fell the day the news reached New York, not because investors had reason to believe that any specific business would fail without him, but because the markets, like all human institutions, are composed of people who respond to the loss of something they had come to depend on, even when they had never quite acknowledged the dependence. For 40 years, whenever the worst happened, Morgan had been there. The room full of locked doors, the card table, the solitaire, the inexorable gathering of signatures in the small hours of the morning. And now he was gone. The Federal Reserve, which had been authorized in December 1913, opened for business in November 1914, 16 months after his death, 1 year after the passage of the act his career had made inevitable. It was, in every sense that mattered, his legacy. Not the legacy he would have chosen. He would not have chosen any legacy that reduced the role of private banking judgment in the management of financial crises, and the Federal Reserve was explicitly designed to do exactly that. But the legacy the country needed. The public institution built to do, systematically and accountably, and with the backing of democratic government, what one extraordinary private man had been doing irregularly and unaccountably, and with the backing of nothing except his own iron will. The arc of the story is complete, and it is, in its way, perfect. A man of such extraordinary power that his career demonstrated, beyond any serious argument, that private power on that scale could not be allowed to exist without public counterbalance. A man of such extraordinary integrity that his career demonstrated equally beyond argument that the alternative to private standards of excellence was not automatically public standards of excellence but often the absence of any standards at all. A man, in short, whose greatness and whose menace were not separate and successive chapters of the same story but simultaneous and inseparable features of the same force. He stood at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street in New York, the physical and symbolic center of American finance, and he looked at the world with those impossible eyes, and the world, for a generation, looked back and saw in him the closest thing to an answer that the wild, magnificent, reckless, productive, destructive experiment of American capitalism had yet managed to produce. He was the answer. He was also, inevitably and correctly, the question. The library still stands on East 36th Street. The fire burns. The books keep their counsel. The marble is as pink and quiet as the day it was laid. The doors are open now. They have been for a very long time. End of script. To fully understand how J.P. Morgan controlled America, you have to understand what America looked like before he controlled it, and why the controlling, whatever its costs, was in some sense the necessary precondition for everything the country became in the 20th century. In 1870, the United States was a large, fast-growing, deeply disorganized economy. It had enormous natural resources: coal, iron, oil, timber, agricultural land of incomprehensible extent. It had a young, energetic, ambitious population that was being continuously reinforced by waves of immigration from Europe. It had a legal system that, whatever its many failures, provided a reasonably reliable framework for contract enforcement and property rights. What it did not have, what it had conspicuously, structurally, almost constitutionally failed to develop, was a financial system adequate to the scale of the industrial development it was undertaking. The scale is difficult to convey in modern terms. The railroad networks being built in the 1870s and 1880s were not merely large infrastructure projects. They were the largest peacetime construction effort in the history of human civilization to that point. Tens of thousands of miles of track, thousands of bridges and tunnels and station houses and maintenance facilities, laid down across a continent at a pace that required capital mobilization of a kind that had never previously been attempted. The money had to come from somewhere. In the United States of the 1870s, it came primarily from Britain, from the vast pools of capital accumulated by the British Empire over a century of industrial development and global trade, capital that was looking for investment opportunities and finding them in enormous quantities in the American West. The flow of British capital into American railroads was mediated, primarily, by a small number of banking houses that had the relationships, the trust, and the analytical competence to serve as intermediaries between British investors and American operators. Morgan's firm Drexel, Morgan & Company, as it was known until 1895, when it became J.P. Morgan & Company, was the most important of these intermediaries. And its importance was directly proportional to one thing: the confidence that British investors had in the Morgan name as a guarantee of quality. This confidence was earned, not assumed. In the early years, Morgan had to prove, transaction by transaction, that his firm's assurances meant something, that when a Morgan prospectus said a railroad bond was investment grade, it was genuinely investment grade. That when Morgan signed on as a director of a company, he was genuinely overseeing its management rather than merely lending his name in exchange for a fee. The proof was provided, over years and decades, through the simple mechanism of being right more often than wrong and of making investors whole when the firm's judgment proved to have been incorrect. By the 1880s, the proof was complete. The Morgan name was the most trusted brand in American finance, trusted not because of Morgan's self-promotion, not because of advertising or marketing or public relations in any modern sense, but because the track record was real and because the people who had invested in Morgan-endorsed securities had been, systematically and over time, treated fairly. This was the foundation. And on this foundation, the entire edifice of Morgan power, the railroad control, the steel monopoly, the banking network, the gold rescues, the panic management was built. He was not the only powerful banker in America. Jay Gould was, at various times in the 1870s and 1880s, as powerful as Morgan in purely financial terms, richer, certainly the master of a particular style of financial manipulation that Morgan found personally repugnant. Gould operated by acquisition and extraction. He would take control of a railroad, strip its assets, manipulate its stock, and move on, leaving behind a wreckage of disappointed investors and unpaid creditors that eventually required someone like Morgan to clean up. The contrast between the two men is instructive. Gould was wealthy but not trusted. Morgan was trusted, and the trust, in the long run, was worth more than the wealth. Then there was John D. Rockefeller. In oil, Rockefeller had done what Morgan was doing in railroads and steel, had consolidated a chaotic, competitive industry into a single dominant entity, Standard Oil, that controlled the production and distribution of petroleum with a comprehensiveness that made Morgan's railroad empire look modestly diversified. The two men respected each other in the way that very powerful people who operate in adjacent but not directly competitive spheres tend to do, warily, professionally, with mutual acknowledgement of the other's effectiveness and mutual relief that their primary interests did not directly conflict. They did, once, threaten to conflict. In the mid-1890s, Rockefeller had been acquiring significant quantities of iron ore in the Lake Superior region, or deposits that were essential to Carnegie's steel production and that Rockefeller apparently intended to use as leverage in a broader play for the steel industry. The prospect of a Rockefeller-Carnegie industrial conflict, with Morgan's railroad network in the middle, was one that none of the parties involved found appetizing. The negotiations that resolved this potential conflict were conducted through intermediaries and were never fully disclosed, but the result, that Rockefeller sold his or holdings to the Morgan-Carnegie steel consolidation at a price that satisfied him without requiring him to become an industrial combatant, was entirely consistent with Morgan's characteristic approach to potential conflict. Identify the problem early. Find the price at which the problem goes away. Pay it. The psychology of all this, the specific mental operations through which Morgan exercised his extraordinary judgment, deserves more attention than it typically receives. He was not a systematic analyst in the academic sense. He did not build complex financial models or produce lengthy memoranda or surround himself with teams of economists generating quantitative projections. He read. He listened. He asked questions. He formed judgments quickly, sometimes in the time it took a man to state his proposition, sometimes over days of private reflection, and he trusted those judgments with a completeness that most people, in most circumstances, cannot achieve because they are too aware of their own fallibility. His judgment about people was particularly acute. He was a student of character in the deepest sense, interested not in what a man said about himself but in what his history revealed about him, in the gap or the alignment between his stated principles and his demonstrated behavior, in the specific kind of pressure that would reveal whether the integrity he projected was real or performed. He would test people, sometimes with small acts of deliberate inconvenience, arriving late to a meeting, proposing terms slightly less favorable than agreed, watching to see how the reaction was managed. A man who responded to small provocations with disproportionate anger or with the kind of compliant over-agreement that suggested he would agree to anything told Morgan something important. A man who responded with calm, measured assertion of his legitimate interests told him something equally important, and generally more favorable. He was also, and this surprises people, a man with a genuine sense of humor. Not the polished social humor of a politician or the self-deprecating irony of a man comfortable with his own success, but the dry, sudden, slightly unsettling humor of someone who saw the absurdity in situations that others were too intimidated or too deferential to acknowledge. He once told a young associate who had presented him with an overly elaborate financial analysis that the man had used 2 days to tell him something that was either true in 1 sentence or not true in 100. He dismissed a prospectus for a new industrial venture with the observation that the only part of it he found credible was the date at the top. These were not cruel remarks, exactly. They were the remarks of a man who had no patience for unnecessary complexity, who valued directness above all intellectual virtues, and who found the gap between what people said and what was actually true to be one of the more reliable sources of private entertainment available to someone in his position. When he died, the Morgan Empire did not die with him. His son Jack, John Pierpont Morgan Jr., known always as Jack to distinguish him from his father, took over the firm and ran it for the next 3 decades with a competence and an integrity that the elder Morgan would have recognized, even as the world the firm operated in changed in ways that neither man could have fully predicted. Jack Morgan financed the Allied powers during the First World War, organizing the largest single financial transaction in history to that point, a $500 million loan to Britain and France in 1915 that was essential to their ability to purchase American arms and supplies. He navigated the firm through the regulatory changes of the New Deal era, when the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced the separation of commercial and investment banking and required the Morgan firm to choose one or the other, a choice that split the house into 2 separate entities, J.P. Morgan and Company on the commercial side and Morgan Stanley on the investment banking side. The name survived. The reputation survived. The culture survived, in attenuated and modified form, through generations of change that the founder could not have imagined. The firm that is today called J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States by assets, a global financial institution of extraordinary reach and complexity, bears only a genealogical resemblance to the private partnership that operated from 23 Wall Street. But it carries the name. And the name, as the man himself always said, was the thing. What has not survived, and what cannot survive in the institutional landscape of the modern world, is the specific form of authority that J.P. Morgan exercised. The authority of one man whose word was sufficient. The authority of personal reputation as the ultimate financial instrument. The authority that could lock a room full of bankers and keep them there through sheer force of character until the country was saved. This is both a loss and a gain. It is a loss because that kind of authority was, when it was well used, and in Morgan's case it was most often well used, extraordinarily efficient. Decisions that took regulatory committees months of deliberation and consultation could be made in an evening in a library on Madison Avenue. Resources that required congressional authorization and presidential signature could be mobilized in hours by a man with the right relationships and the right reputation. In a genuine crisis, speed matters, and the speed of the Morgan method, however troubling its implications for democratic accountability, was not a trivial advantage. It is a gain because the accountability it lacked was not a procedural nicety. It was the substance of democratic governance. The people whose savings were invested in Morgan-reorganized railroads, the workers in Morgan-controlled steel mills, the consumers served by Morgan-financed utilities, none of them had any voice in the decisions that shaped their economic lives. They were not consulted. They were not represented. They were not even fully informed. They were the passive beneficiaries, or the passive victims, of a financial system whose governing intelligence resided in a single man who answered, ultimately, to no one. The story of how J.P. Morgan controlled America is, in the end, the story of how America learned what needed to be controlled, and by whom and under what terms and with what limitations. It is the story of how a country that had been founded on suspicion of concentrated power came face to face with concentrated power of a scale it had never previously imagined, and discovered, through the painful, expensive, decade-long process of the progressive era, that the answer was not to find a better Morgan, but to build the institutions that would make the next Morgan unnecessary. Those institutions were built. They are imperfect. They always will be. But they exist and they function, and they stand between the American public and the kind of helpless dependence on private financial genius that characterized the Morgan era. A dependence that was, in its day, both necessary and intolerable. He would have understood this. Near the end of his life, Morgan told a friend that the great mistake of his career had been to assume that the standards he had imposed on the system were self-sustaining, that the culture of integrity he had built in his own firm and, to a lesser extent, in the broader banking community would persist without the institutional framework to enforce it. He had assumed that, because he and his partners behaved honestly, the system would work. He had not fully reckoned with the fact that the system worked only because of them, and that the people who came after them might not be them. It was, as admissions go, a remarkably honest one. A man of his era, his class, his absolute confidence in his own judgment, admitting that the judgment was personal rather than systemic, that it was mortal rather than permanent, that the country needed something that would last beyond him. He was the last of his kind. The last man who could walk into the White House with a private proposal to save the dollar and be listened to not merely as a petitioner but as an equal. The last man whose personal integrity was the financial system's last line of defense. The last man who could lock a room and wait. The fire in the library burns on. The marble is cold and pink and exact. The books are patient. The collection is permanent. The man is gone. But the country he helped to build, that raucous, ambitious, industrializing, self-correcting, perpetually unfinished American project, that continues. It was never his. It was never anyone's. It was always, in the end, the thing beyond all the banks and all the bonds and all the locked library doors and all the extraordinary personal force deployed in the service of keeping it together. It was the country itself. And it outlasted him, as it was always meant to,